Bonjour, Ani-kwe, Kaitlyn Patterson, Ottawa North Bay and Dojaba, Portland and Diane, Mong Nadodum. My name is Kaitlyn. I'm a member of the Loon clan, and I'm a mixed ancestry Algonquin Anishinaabe-kwe from Ottawa North Bay Algonquin First Nation. I'm also a member of the urban and business community in Kingston, having lived in the area for most of my life. And I'm currently living in Portland, which is about an hour north of Kingston on the traditional territories of the Huron-Wendat, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee peoples. So with that, we'll get started. For this talk about decolonizing Indigenous food systems, I thought I would share a few stories. Storytelling is a critical methodology in many Indigenous cultures through which knowledge, tradition, relationship, responsibility, and identity are transported across generations. Stories are told in a variety of ways, including through song, dreams, oratory, and the land directly. Stories can also be memories of past relationships with land, humans, and more than humans, and provide guidance for our future relations. Storytelling is fundamentally relational, and meaning is co-produced within the interconnections of storyteller, story, and listener. The process of sharing stories is not necessarily a linear event. Often the significance of a story is left open for the listener to distinguish for themselves. Listeners may take what they need and what they are prepared for at the time. In this way, storytelling is an empowering methodology because all are engaged in the meaning-making process. With that in mind, in this presentation, I will be telling stories, asking questions, and leaving some topics open for each of you to consider for yourselves. My storytelling approach as a person with mixed ancestry also incorporates the concept of two-eyed seeing. Two-eyed seeing involves weaving together Indigenous knowledges and ways of knowing with Western knowledge systems. Two-eyed seeing affirms Indigenous knowledge as an autonomous entity and also recognizes the importance of bringing Indigenous and Western ways of knowing together for the benefit of all. As I reflect on my life experiences, I attempt to reconcile Anishinaabe life ways with my academic training as a registered dietitian in Canada, where Anishinaabe knowledge systems are not popularly incorporated or accepted. While I attempt to do this, I acknowledge that I am not a knowledge keeper, and therefore my qualifications for this task are quite limited. With that said, these processes of reflection have helped me question fundamental systems of knowledge within dietetics, as well as my role as an Anishinaabe-kwe dietitian going forward. As I critically reflect on my own motives and methods, others who are entangled and engaged in food systems may do so as well. So first, I want to tell you a story about my shifting imaginings about the food systems I grew up with and that surround me now. I want to begin by telling you about the medicine walk I went on last spring with my brother and my mother. I fill my pack with medicines and secure it on my waist. My brother and mom are waiting for me. I place some sage on my cast iron pan and light the smudge. The smoke rises and we wash ourselves. We had decided to go on a walk at my parents' house to see the marsh and to find some food and medicines along the way. My mom knows the land better than my brother and I. She has known the land longer and more intimately. As we walk over the stone bridge and into the first field, she calls out members of Tree Nation and identifies animal tracks and scat. How long has she known how to do this? Where did she learn? I used to go out hunting with your prepare when I was a kid. We would walk through the bush together and name trees and look at animal tracks. And your uncle and I would go out and check all the snares, and we'd give whatever we got to our grandmother. And when I got older, I used to make meals for the whole family, my mother explains. My brother brings a book along with him to help identify plants, but he rarely opens it along the walk. He touches the trees at the edge of the field, sees vines wrapped around them, and is happy to know that there will be grapes here in the fall. We need to come back, my brother determines. Why can't I find grapes on my own too? Kaitlyn, remember how I would spend summers in Mattawa? My brother explains. I put some tobacco down and I say thanks and see you soon to the vines, and we keep walking. My mother is trailing behind a bit, lingering on the tree line and looking down at the creek. The deer love it here, my mom says. There are raspberry bushes, raspberry canes, as my mother lovingly corrects me, over by the bridge, and water from the creek runs gently towards the farmhouse next door. She points to the deer tracks and recognizes they've got a great place to live. The ground goes soft under our boots as we approach the marsh. The marsh used to be a small lake where my brother once toured around on his fishing boat, but the beavers had clearly been at work upstream. As we arrive, I think about the last time we were all here together. I was just a kid. I don't even know how old. So much has happened since then, and so much has changed for me and for the land. We weave through the cattails that surround the edge of the pond and head toward rocks that line the water. We climb up and share some space on the rocks and look out over the marsh. The wind is calm today, and the water lays still. Do you know that big breath you take when you find yourself face to face with the land? I stood and inhaled, felt my lungs fill, and my mind swell with memories. It was like sitting in a comfortable chair with a cozy blanket. It was slipping into a warm bath filled to the brim to cover your whole body. I felt completely full, whole, and finally home. Suddenly, my mom claps her hands and breaks my gaze. She has been doing that throughout the entire walk. Sorry, it's for the bears. You have to let them know you're coming, she had explained the first time. Mukwa, I think to myself. When we are ready to leave, we get down off the rocks and start back through the cattails. As we move, I say, I read this book, Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer, that said you can eat cattails and that they also have a gel substance inside similar to aloe vera that can help with bug bites and scratches. My brother sighs. Yeah, Kaitlyn, I know. I had some on my camping trip a few weeks ago. I am behind the ball again. I don't bother telling him that I also looked up the nutrients in a cattail on the Canadian Nutrient File website. I have a feeling he will not be impressed by my knowing how many grams of carbohydrate are in a 100-gram portion of cattail root. We reach the edge of the cattails and walk into the fields, but I turn back. Want to try harvesting one? I'd like to see how I can cook them in different ways, and if we like it, we can come back in the fall to harvest more. I lay some tobacco down again, and my brother and I dig up a cattail. As the three of us walk back toward the house, my mom clapping intermittently along the way, I wonder out loud, how is it that I am a dietitian with a master's in nutrition, and yet I don't know how to identify grapes by looking at their vines? Shouldn't I know that it is called a raspberry cane and not a raspberry bush? Why can't I feel the trees and know their names? Why do I know the smoke point of avocado oil? I don't know how to cook a cattail from the land I've lived on my whole life. We walk back to my parents' house and part ways. On my drive home, I wrestled with these thoughts some more. It was a great trip to the marsh, and I was fortunate to have the land and my family as teachers. However, I am also unpleasantly confronted by the fact that, surprise, surprise, I barely know anything about our food systems on Algonquin territory at all. In my education as a dietitian, I understand why I need to learn about the composition and utility of food, how to use it, and how it helps our bodies. However, I failed to learn about the who behind our food sources. Who are the cattails? Who makes up the relations? Why are these relations crucial to their well-being? Instead of constantly asking myself, situated within my position in dietetics, what can this food do for me and my body? I needed to shift to, what can I do for this being to ensure that our reciprocal relationship with one another is maintained? How do we take care of one another? I needed to go back to the beginning, and in my mind, the core of an Algonquin food system is fundamentally structured by the relations which comprise the system. So let's start there. As an Algonquin Anishinaabe-kwe, I am moving forward on the basis that our realities are produced through our relations with all that surround us. We have a relationship with every human and more than human body that exists, and these relationships produce a cosmos that is shared with all of creation. All of creation is equal and dependent on one another, though Anishinaabe acknowledge that humans were created last and have a lot to learn from our environment. Ultimately, the purpose of gaining knowledge is to shape us as individuals within a larger collective in order to live in harmony with all of creation. Though I understand food systems as more complex than sharp binaries, good versus bad, entirely local versus fully industrialized, it is clear that we have moved away from the foundations of Algonquin relationality and reciprocity within our food systems today. Colonial and capitalist principles have shaped modern food systems so that food is unsustainably extracted, commodified, exploited, and subject to inequitable distribution within the free market. Food, which I understand to be the living beings whom we eat, animals and plants included, is morphed into an object to dominate and control for the purpose of incurring power and wealth for elite groups. Even popularly referring to these beings as food supports this objectification. Food becomes it rather than they, thereby ignoring their living, diverse, multiple bodies. In this process, the animation of those whom we eat, their spirit and interdependent life, is diminished, along with our love and respect for them. I think we once knew the cattails. I think we once loved the cattails, but I think we have forgotten. After this walk, I struggled with where to go next. So let me tell you that story. I grab my lawn chair, book, and a thermos of coffee and start my walk towards the lake. I live a few blocks from the park in town, which overlooks the water. The park is deserted this morning, as it is every morning I come. I untuck my book from under my arm and I set my things down under the old maple tree that offers some company by the lake. The maple's gray reaching limbs extend over me and shade me from the sun and heat, which are already making me uncomfortable at 9 o'clock this morning. Earlier in the season, I used to sit on the grassy bank and slip my feet in the cool, refreshing water below. Now the water level has dropped, revealing a line of rocks and sand along the shoreline my toes can't quite reach anymore. I unfold my chair and place my thermos beside me. I feel the soft ground give a little as the pegs of my chair push into the grass when I sit down. I crack open my book. After our medicine walk, I've been working my way through book after book about Indigenous methodologies, histories, ceremonies, storywork, plants, and more. I am desperate to answer one fundamental question. How do I remember? How do I come to know my relations once more? How do I learn about the life ways that I have forgotten? How did these become my new ways of seeing the world and the food systems in which I am embedded? Is it possible to reconcile my knowledge of food within dietetics with Algonquin understandings of land and our more than human relations? By weaving together complementary and often contradictory knowledges, experiences, and views, perhaps I can fulfill my responsibilities as an Indigenous dietitian within the profession and within our complex food systems. Ultimately, the question becomes, how do I, as a dietitian and an Anishinaabe-kwe, embody relationality and reciprocity in everyday life, professional practice, and with all my relations? How do I remember? I sip my coffee and exhale. Taking a break from the page, I look up at the water. There are no boats yet this morning. I have come down too early for that. The only exception I see is a man who is kneeling in an overpacked canoe. Its sides are only inches from the surface of the lake, at risk of taking on water and submerging the whole vehicle. But I release my grip on the arms of my folding chair as the man and his canoe finally reach safety on a dock nearby. I exhale again. The water is fairly calm today, pretty good for the big Rito. But as I take in the beauty of the lake, with its complex curves, clarity, juts, and weeds, I feel the wind pick up and sweep over my shoulders and face. I hear something shuffle in the wind beside me. I turn and notice a familiar friend. Cattails sway in the breeze, waving hello as they defend the shoreline. Bojo apakweshkwayag, cattails. Kaitlyn Patterson, it's nice to meet you. As I mentioned, I belong both to the Algonquin community in Mattawa, as well as the urban Indigenous community within Cataraqui or Kingston, Ontario. For this next part of my talk, I want to focus a bit more on Cattails-kwe. Within Cattails-kwe, the urban Indigenous community is growing with over 7,000 Indigenous peoples of diverse heritages and backgrounds reportedly living in the area in 2014. Cattails-kwe is situated on the traditional territories of the Huron-Wendat, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee peoples, and is located in the dish with one spoon territory, which emphasizes taking only what is needed, leaving some for the next person, and keeping the dish clean. Like many other urban Indigenous communities, community located within Cattails-kwe does not have significant access to land. Despite this, there have been many grassroots initiatives aimed at enhancing and supporting biodiversity and cultural resurgence in the area, such as Little Forest Kingston, an Indigenous food sovereignty garden, and various land-based events and ceremonies hosted by the Kingston Indigenous Languages Nest, just to name a few. This past spring, I saw an article online about an initiative that members of the urban Indigenous community in Cattails-kwe were starting called Little Forest Kingston. Little Forest Kingston is an approach to supporting land after hundreds of years of colonization that have destroyed the majority of Indigenous forests in Ontario. For example, in Cattails-kwe and elsewhere in Canada, urbanization has eliminated many natural spaces, resulting in biodiversity loss, species extinction, and climate change. Yet protecting land is key to human and more than human survival. The Little Forest Initiative in Kingston isn't just about replanting trees, it is about revitalizing the webs of relationships that existed within an entire forest of creation. It is about replanting forests in their complexities. A line of the group's description really struck me. In planting little forests, we help the land remember. With that, I decided to reach out to the Little Forest Kingston group to volunteer. I was asked to join the watering team at one of the forest sites, which also hosted an Indigenous food sovereignty garden. Since that day this past spring, I've been visiting the garden and forest site every Friday morning to water and try my best to remember who I am within creation. So here's another story for you. I slip the key into the lock on the water pump shed, jiggle it a little, twist, and hear the pop of the mechanism as it unlocks. Opening up the doors, the generator sits next to about 100 meters of garden hose. I check the pressure on the pump. Everything looks good this morning, which is reassuring because I'm the only person here at the land this morning. I make sure all the nozzles are tightly sealed before I turn on the generator, set the choke, and rip on the cord that wakes up the engine. With one pull, I hear it come to life. The roar of the engine wakes me up a little too. I flick off the choke and open the tap to let the pressure push water through the hose. I grab the thick looping bundle of green hosiery and begin my journey to the rain barrel across the field where families of seedlings were recently planted. Throughout the summer, people have kindly mowed paths to the main barrels and trees that need watering. Despite shorter grass in the field, the task is still difficult, especially on days when I'm ill prepared. I forgot my running shoes this morning and instead have sandals on my feet. Inside my sandals, my feet slide from side to side from the moisture of the morning dew. The ground is uneven with bumps, divots, and hills that require my full attention as I navigate the land in my slippery sandals. The last time I forgot my runners, I stepped in a hole and threw my back out. But not this time, not today, I tell myself as I finally reach the barrel and drop the hose on the ground beside it. This rain barrel is unique. It is large, black, and has a screw top lid that balances a non-functioning antique iron hand water pump atop its surface. I lift up the hand pump and set it on the ground. I unscrew the lid and grab a white bucket to fill with water from the barrel. Eager to be efficient with my watering, I fill the bucket as full as I can and begin to pull it out of the barrel. As I do, I realize it's heavier than I can manage. I pull and pull as the bucket shakes and teeters. I finally maneuver the bucket to the top of the barrel, but the bottom of the bucket nicks the lip of the barrel and water pours all over my wool sweater. I make a note to myself. More is not always better. Oh, and wool and watering don't go well together. Oops. I am soaked in my heavy wool, sliding in my squeaky sandals as I make my way across the field, zigzagging from sapling to sapling, saying good morning with each delivery of water. White pine has grown taller since the spring. Cedar is full, round, and bright today. The pawpaws are surviving, and the butternuts and maples are looking strong, even if chewed up a bit from the spring caterpillars this year. As I move along, I notice someone has planted raspberry canes, or spomonog, I later learned. So I stop to introduce myself. They look dry and fragile, so I make an agreement to come with water each week for them as well. I move farther along and notice some squash growing too. I wonder, how are you related to the buttercup squash at my house? I remember that squash doesn't want as much water as other beings, so I decide to return with water only on weeks when it isn't too rainy. I finish up with watering and start cleaning up when suddenly I hear voices in the distance across the field. Two voices are carried over the wild carrots, honeysuckle, and ticks hiding in the tall grass. I lock up the water pump shed and head over to where my two fellow gardeners are standing by the second shed on site that is full of gardening tools. Come join us for some Labrador tea, one of the women says. The woman is a grandmother in the urban Indigenous community within Cataraqui, who helped bring the garden and the Little Forest Kingston project to life. And when a grandmother asks you to do something, you don't say no. I head over to the two women who are arranging chairs and setting up a portable camp stove by the garden shed. I take off my soaked wool sweater, throw it to the ground, and sit down on a red wooden scuffed up chair that is left open for me in between the two women. The second woman is another leader in the Little Forest Kingston project, and I quickly learn that she knows a lot about trees. I am handed a cup of Labrador tea, and I can't help but wonder about the nutrition profile. Weeks later, I will learn that 100 grams of fresh Labrador tea leaves provides a great source of iron, vitamin C, niacin, manganese, and copper, and also provides calcium, phosphorus, magnesium, and zinc. However, rather than inquire about the nutritional value, I instead bring up a recent topic that has been swirling around in my mind. So I was at a meeting at school recently where a group of food scholars and activists brainstormed the ways in which Queen's University could help end hunger in Kingston. There were great ideas put forward about publicly advocating for income security and enhancing food supports available on campus and citywide. In that meeting, I couldn't help but think about what an Indigenous community leader recently told me about food. It's not about food in and of itself. It's about land. Colonialism is a major determinant of health for Indigenous peoples that significantly impacts mental, spiritual, and emotional health and increases the risk of chronic disease and early mortality. Colonialism has separated Indigenous peoples from territories, disrupted food-related knowledges and skills, contaminated food supplies, and ultimately threatened access to culturally supportive, nutritious food sources. All of these factors have resulted in higher rates of food insecurity for Indigenous peoples and a breakdown in Indigenous food sovereignty. Indigenous food sovereignty defines Indigenous peoples' control over their food environments, emphasizing Indigenous self-determination and reconciliation of colonial laws and policies with cultural values of respect, reciprocity, responsibility, and relationship with land as an autonomous entity. Indigenous food sovereignty happens when Indigenous peoples define and have meaningful connections with food systems, including where and how food is grown, harvested, cooked, eaten, and reciprocally cared for. It involves protecting, maintaining, and regenerating food sources, which necessarily means respecting how lands and waters are used and ensuring they are not misused. Indigenous food sovereignty is fundamentally a practice of land sovereignty. Given that colonialism is a critical threat to land sovereignty, a requisite decolonized approach to food security and Indigenous food sovereignty involves land back and land rematriation, whereby Indigenous peoples help restore culture, spirituality, and food environments through Indigenous-led processes rooted in respect, reciprocity, and relationship with all living beings. But how do Indigenous peoples achieve land back? And more specifically, how can the urban Indigenous community within Cattails achieve land back? One way in which Indigenous peoples have gained greater control over territory is through Indigenous-led conservation. For example, protected areas are an internationally recognized option for biodiversity conservation, with as many as half of protected lands globally located on traditional territories occupied or regularly accessed by Indigenous peoples. However, protected and conserved areas, for example, national parks, also come with a dark history of environmental dispossession for Indigenous peoples. Even the concept of quote unquote preserving land is problematic because it is deeply rooted in white supremacist ideologies and settler colonial imaginings of a pre-contact, pristine wilderness, uncontaminated by human interaction, despite thousands of years of Indigenous occupation and land and resource management. The idea of nature as quote unquote pure has informed racist relocation policies targeted at Indigenous peoples, moving them away from carefully preserved natural areas and segregating them to cities, undesirable remote areas and far from ancestral territories. Historically, government agencies and NGOs have ignored Indigenous peoples' roles in contributing to biodiversity. Protected areas have simply been another way for settlers to gain more control over Indigenous lands, transforming it into property as a means to gain power and wealth. With that said, more recently in the international arena of conservation projects, Indigenous peoples have been increasingly recognized for their roles in biodiversity guardianship. In the early 2000s, the term Indigenous Peoples and Community Conserved Territories and Areas, or ICCAs, was coined to describe new imaginings of Indigenous-led conservation projects grounded in biodiversity protection, cultural practices, and Indigenous laws. Since the early 2000s, ICCAs have rapidly expanded and strengthened Indigenous peoples' agency by enhancing access to land, environmental stewardship, community empowerment, cultural identity, capacity building, and of course, biodiversity. In Canada, the Indigenous Circle of Experts, or ICE, a group of Indigenous experts and government officials, was established to help meet Target 1 of the 2020 biodiversity goals and targets for Canada. These were instituted after the 2010 conference of the parties to the Convention on Biological Diversity in Nagoya, Japan. ICE emphasizes the value of Indigenous, protected, and conserved areas, or IPCAs, to help protect lands and waters within Canada. And this was discussed in the We Rise Together report seen on this screen. IPCAs describe a bundle of diverse land protection initiatives that are led by Indigenous governments in collaboration with federal, provincial, and territorial governments in Canada in a proposed ethical space rooted in reconciliation, sharing, respect, and transparency. While IPCAs take many forms, for example, tribal parks, Indigenous cultural landscapes, Indigenous protected areas, Indigenous conserved areas, they're all Indigenous-led, committed to conservation, and rooted in Indigenous rights and responsibilities. IPCAs across Canada have respected Indigenous knowledge systems, protocols, laws, governments, and ceremony, and have supported the revitalization of Indigenous languages, food systems, conservation practices, and cultural activities, while also promoting biodiversity within ancestral territories. Although IPCAs have benefited a number of Indigenous nations, I wonder whether this approach would be appropriate for the urban Indigenous community within Cattails. For example, in the context of colonialism, many Indigenous peoples are reluctant to enter into land dealings with the Canadian government in a proposed ethical space that ultimately does not support Indigenous governance independent of colonial government. In my mind, IPCAs require a lot of trust in an environment where trust has been broken time and time again, and where genocide continues to be committed against Indigenous peoples. The urban Indigenous community within Cattails, like all urban Indigenous collectives within Canada, does not have a federally recognized governance structure in place, for example, a band and council established through the Indian Act. Without a recognized Indigenous government, will advocacy by a collective of urban Indigenous peoples for an IPCA be acknowledged or taken seriously by provincial, territorial, or federal government? Who from the urban Indigenous community would be welcome at the negotiation table? If in the case the urban Indigenous community within Cataraqui establishes an IPCA with government, will uneven power dynamics resulting from hundreds of years of environmental dispossession undermine the relationship? If the relationship fails, will this impact urban Indigenous peoples' control over existing Indigenous-led land-based initiatives already in place? I do not ask these questions to merely critique IPCAs. In fact, as mentioned, IPCAs have helped many Indigenous peoples achieve land back and work towards land rematriation. Thinking through the options for land back for urban Indigenous communities within Canada is important because the number of Indigenous peoples living in cities, whether temporarily or permanently, totaled 1.7 million people in 2016, which was more than half of the total Indigenous population within Canada at that time. And colonialism has contributed to the growing population of Indigenous peoples living in urban spaces through a variety of mechanisms. For example, the Indian Act redefined indigeneity and legislated sexist policies of relocation, and many Indigenous peoples were removed from their territories, families, and cultures to attend residential schools. Urban Indigenous communities are made up of generations of Indigenous peoples who hold rights to ancestral lands and waters despite histories of dispossession. I also want to note that while there is overlap and fluidity within the suggested reserve-urban binary, those who dwell in urban areas face unique barriers to accessing land that must be considered. So what strategies for land back are available for the circumstances faced by urban Indigenous people specifically? Outside of IPCAs, Indigenous groups have transcended colonial jurisdictions and taken up physical occupation of lands and waters as a way to establish greater control over territories. For example, the Tiny House Warriors, a group primarily led by women in the Secwepemc Women's Warrior Society, built tiny houses along the proposed Trans Mountain Pipeline route to stop its development on their unceded land. Building houses allowed tiny house warriors to reassert their presence, resist development of the pipeline in unceded territory, and provide environmentally conscious housing for families. Land back activities and colonial resistance are ongoing. There are more examples of Indigenous nations occupying land and water to protect the environment and affirm Indigenous sovereignty. However, in many cases, physical occupation has been most successful for Indigenous nations who have strong title claims, which alters the balance of power and makes government or industry more likely to negotiate rather than inflict violence and remove people by police or military involvement, though even Indigenous nations with strong claims have experienced this. There are also situations where Indigenous peoples have purchased land or received donations of land by settlers or churches as a step towards reconciliation. While land donation may seem like a straightforward solution, colonial legal systems have made it very difficult to simply return land to Indigenous peoples by this method. As a result, several Indigenous nations and communities have struggled with how to hold land in ways that honor Indigenous legal systems and protect it from repeated colonial theft. For example, for First Nations governments, band councils do not have the Western legal authority to own land because reserve land is technically owned by the federal government. First Nations can apply for an addition to reserve, but this process often takes years and is frequently protested by settlers who live near the new proposed reserve lands. As an alternative to this route, Indigenous peoples have established land trusts to achieve land back and work towards goals of biodiversity protection. In Ontario, land trusts are nonprofit charitable organizations that acquire land for the primary goal of conservation. While the majority of land trusts in Canada are led by non-Indigenous groups, some land trusts are Indigenous-led. For example, the first Indigenous-led land trust within Ontario was established in 2008 by Walpole Island First Nation. More recently, in October 2020, two Métis women living in Alberta purchased 65 hectares of land with money that was donated by a non-Indigenous person, and this land was put in a trust. The Assembly of Nova Scotia Mi'kmaq Chiefs also recently announced the new Mi'kmaq-led Cespedes d'Aménage Gamitkanu Conservancy, which is a land trust being developed with funding from Environment and Climate Change Canada's Nature Fund and the Nova Scotia Department of Environment and Climate Change. Indigenous-led land trusts offer a way for urban Indigenous peoples to take direct action and hold land for biodiversity restoration and cultural resurgence initiatives, and to safeguard lands for future generations of Indigenous peoples. Land trusts offer a legal mechanism of land guardianship for urban Indigenous communities who may have greater difficulty accessing land through nation-to-nation agreements because they are not federally recognized as nations. As a member of the urban Indigenous community in Cattails, I believe establishing a land trust could be a successful strategy to help ensure Indigenous community members have access to land in the context of ongoing land dispossession with constant urbanization and city development in Kingston. To me, this seems like a viable option to achieve land back and continue projects of land rematriation. However, establishing a land trust also has several challenges. For example, in the urban Indigenous community within Cattails, there is no federally recognized Indigenous governance structure. As such, Indigenous peoples within Cattails, in the effort of establishing a land trust, would be tasked with developing a governance structure that provides a leadership framework for the nonprofit charitable organization. The proposed governance structure must also be woven into communities so that it reasonably represents the interests of community ongoing. When defining the boundaries of community, historical and modern relationships with land agreements, and treaties must be considered carefully. Given the complexity of urban Indigenous communities in terms of relationships, histories, politics, ancestries, cultures, and more, this is no small task. Indigenous-led land trusts must also articulate a clear direction for transition of leadership over time to ensure the trust is governed according to its mission and values across generations. Another issue involves land being conceptualized as property in this process. Establishing a land trust may frame Indigenous relationships with lands and waters in state-centric terms. This may reinforce colonial power and governance structures that actively oppress Indigenous peoples and dispossess groups from ancestral lands in the first place. Further, some scholars and activists warn that participating in legal activities to establish a trust may also distract from important cultural resurgence activities and more direct, tangible, practical actions aimed at improving biodiversity. However, I argue that even though land within a trust would be classified as property according to colonial definitions, the missions, values, and governance of a land trust can be structured in ways that honor and respect relationships with land and waters and uphold their responsibilities as interdependent members of creation rather than stewards of repatriated property. I also contend that spending time in these legal processes would be worth the investment in 7 generations' time and beyond. One final and important consideration I will mention is the cost associated with founding and maintaining a land trust. Costs associated with rehabilitating the land, paying local taxes, hosting cultural land-based events, and supporting employees may all be factors to consider when operating a land trust. Colonialism has separated Indigenous peoples from lands, waters, and the relationships that structure our existence. When people interact with land and water, they remember who they are, their roles, their responsibilities, and their sources of strength. The relationship is reestablished. Remembering who we are as part of creation is an important aspect of resurgence, an integral process of rematriation. But in order to rebuild relationships with land, Indigenous peoples must have the opportunity to actually be in relationship. Indigenous peoples need their lands and waters back. Utilizing Indigenous land strategies to secure access to land through IPCAs, land trusts, or otherwise, and upholding Indigenous governance are assertions of self-determination. Having greater control over land in a Western legal sense also translates into real opportunity to safeguard meaningful engagement within Indigenous food systems, honoring and fulfilling our responsibilities to our relations. As Tuck and Yang infamously note, decolonization is not a metaphor. It involves returning Indigenous lands and lifeways to Indigenous peoples. Decolonizing Indigenous food systems, therefore, must result in land back and land rematriation, whereby land is returned and ways forward are centered on strengthening Indigenous lifeways, including culture, spirituality, and social connections, in relationship with all of creation and in support of the Earth Way, or the ways in which the Earth is inherently ordered. I started volunteering with Little Forest Kingston when I read their quote, "In planting little forests, we help the land remember." I read this at a time when I was actively seeking what my roles were and how I fit within creation as a dietitian and a mixed-ancestry Anishinaabe-kwe with European and Algonquin ancestry and connection to 2 Indigenous communities. By sitting on the land, drinking Labrador tea, and spending time with the trees, I can't help but feel the land is helping me remember too. Chimigwech for listening. And a page of references, and that's it.
Thank you so much, Kaitlyn Miigwech. I really appreciated listening to not only your stories, but also all the valuable information you shared. It's really hard to weave that kind of academic research information with stories, and I think you've done it wonderfully. And I'm seeing so much positivity in the chat box right now. Many miigweches coming through, a very powerful thank yous. I wonder if anybody has any questions or comments for Kaitlyn. You can pop them into the chat box. Right now it's thanks coming through. So thank you so much for sharing your stories and wisdom today. Chimigwech, so wonderful, such a wonderful talk.
I should,
go ahead.
Sorry, can I just add one more thing?
Yeah.
The first story is published. The first part of that talk was a story and essay pieces that I published, I think, beginning of this year, perhaps, or the end of last year, entitled "Who Are the Cattails?" So if anybody wants to look at the story again, read it, it's available online, and it's open access, so it won't cost anybody any money to look at the article if they would like to.
Sure, and I can send that around. Perhaps you can email me the link to that, Kaitlyn, and I'll send it to everyone that was here today. I'm just seeing many thanks here. I'm not seeing any questions. Lauren says, I'm a Queen's alumni as well, watching from Sarnia, Ontario. Thank you for letting us hear and see what's happening over there in the Kingston area. I'm very interested to learn about the land and land-related issues. Sabrina says, truly beautiful and informative and refreshing. And Heather says, Chimigwech, great job. Well, thank you everybody for joining us today. And thank you so much, Kaitlyn. Oh, here we go. We've got a question. What are the first steps that disconnected people, not connected to groups, perhaps living in cities, can do to develop improved relationships with the land? How can we protect and nurture?
Big question. And I think one question that I had for myself at kind of the beginning of this journey for me, when I was first thinking about how I can get back restoring my relationship with land. And what I would say, just based on my own experience, is to try to find any time to spend with land. And whether that means going to a park, going outside to a creek, going wherever it might be, and just sitting and being with the land, trying to learn more about it. I also, likely because of my academic side, I also read quite a few books on plants, and in connection with my dietetics background, just to kind of learn more about who my relations are and what they need. And also trying to find people in your community who are interested in plants and the land as well, or trying to find people who are already involved in some perhaps land back initiatives or biodiversity projects, and learning from the people who are around you as well to help restore that relationship. Yeah, I'm not sure if that was helpful.
I think so. Stacy also said community gardens are a good place to start, and food tables.
Absolutely.
And Yvette said, yes, it's helpful, the person who asked questions. Jocelyn asks, what do you see as your path forward? Big question.
I don't know. Well, in terms of biodiversity, I think like a land trust in Kingston would be amazing, an Indigenous-led land trust. There are land trusts already in Kingston that I believe are not led by Indigenous peoples, but by settlers who are living in the area, who have similar goals of biodiversity protection. But I think an Indigenous-led land trust would be amazing. But lots to consider as I went through in my talk before that does happen. So yeah, and I wouldn't also mind, well, I would love actually connecting with other Indigenous groups who have established land trusts or who have established IPCAs, or taken up physical occupation, to really any kind of experience with land back, to learn from each other. Would be amazing. So if anybody is involved with that, feel free to reach out to me. Happy to share experiences.
Absolutely. And Kaitlyn, if you wish, you can put your email in the chat, or if you want, people can contact me and I can divert them to you. It's up to you.
Sure. Why don't we go that route? I'll give my email in the email I send you with the link to that article, and you can pass along my information, because I have a few emails that I use. So
great. Okay, perfect. And if anybody has questions in the meantime, you can contact me at kcoordinator@ihc.life, and I'll just drop my email in the chat box. So if anybody wants to connect with Kaitlyn immediately, you can let me know and I'll hook you up with that. Someone asks, are you aware of any international case studies around documenting traditional and Indigenous food systems?
No, I am not aware. There may be. I would love to learn about that if a project like that is ongoing, or someone's writing a report, or a group of people are writing a report about what's been done. I find, with my limited experience reviewing literature related to Indigenous-led land back approaches, or approaches to land back, that there aren't many comprehensive resources available that clearly articulate the approaches for urban Indigenous communities, which is what I'm most interested in at this time. But really, like any reports that would go into international versus national versus Ontario would be interesting to me. I think more work needs to be done, but I know people are working on that right now too. So
great. Stacy says that University of Michigan might be a good place to start that search. So I'm not sure.
Great, thank you.
And Kim says Treaties Recognition Week is coming up. Are you aware of any provincial land bank movements that may be occurring to increase awareness on this topic?
No, I am not.
Well, I'll see if I see anything. I'll try and share it with everybody. Now people are warmed up. We're getting some questions. Do you have any books to recommend for a disconnected Indigenous person to learn about Indigenous knowledge?
Well, that would depend on where a person is from, because the Indigenous knowledges are so specific to place, to nation, to the specific histories and the relationships that exist within a place. So I don't really have any recommendations necessarily that would help, everybody. But maybe if you want to reach out to me via email, we can kind of explore some resources together. Maybe I can be helpful, maybe not.
Okay, perfect. Let me just see here. Emily says, how might these perspectives inform clinical work as a dietitian?
Great question. And that's something I think about all the time. All the time. Let me think on that some more, and then in maybe 10 years I'll write something once I have an answer. Maybe a little farther in my career, because these are topics that I'm just kind of learning how to reconcile my backgrounds with. And I think I used to see, relationships with land and like my Indigenous background and history, and I used to see it as entirely separate. So as a scholar and as a person, I'm trying to bring those two backgrounds that clash often together and see how I can move forward with both of these backgrounds. So I'm not sure is my answer, but maybe I will have an answer for you in a handful of years.
We'll have to have you back, Kaitlyn.
Yeah.
I'm gathering, people are sharing information in the chat box. Really interesting to watch this. I can barely keep up. But Kaylee says, what are your thoughts on the cultivation of Indigenous decolonized foods? Arama First Nation has a community farm, and we're looking to cultivate small amounts of heritage plants reserved for community gatherings.
That sounds great, but can you repeat the question again?
Yeah, so what are your thoughts on the cultivation of Indigenous decolonized foods?
Oh, wow, I love it. I mean, I would love to spend the rest of my life working on projects such as that in my community, or collaborating with other Indigenous communities. I'll have to get the name of that nation that you just mentioned so I can look up any work that they've done. Hopefully they have websites or perhaps papers documenting what they've done. That would be excellent to learn from. And I do think that there should be a lot more collaboration between not only in urban Indigenous communities, though that would be great, but other Indigenous communities across Canada to kind of strengthen our approaches and learn from each other.
Fantastic. Someone else mentioned a report on changes being implemented with Indigenous peoples in Australia. And Lauren says that earth ships are also an incredible option for sustainability and growing food year round. They're difficult to permit in urban residential areas, but are often welcomed without needing as many permits on reserves. They work with elements of land to provide basic needs without disrupting the land by hooking up to the grid. They have a nonprofit site. So I've pulled the link there and dropped it in an email, and I can send this to you, or I'll share the chat box for you, Kaitlyn, after the presentation. Great. And I'll share these resources with everybody that's here as well. Kim says, I can remember a time when I was working in renal dialysis and a client mentioned a particular tea, and I didn't know the content, some of the mineral contents, and it took some time to get access to those. Emily thanks you for your thoughtful answer, and she'll be waiting for your update in 10 years.
Great. There is a great book that provides some nutrition information on some Indigenous plants in Canada. It's Traditional Plant Foods of Canadian Indigenous Peoples. But I believe it is quite expensive, but I think it's about $300, which is quite expensive, but it is a great resource, sorry.
Stacy says the US is far ahead of Canada in this area. And here's, I'd love to try and get to everyone. We are running out of time here, but I do think this is one interesting question to perhaps end on, about the Canada Food Guide and thinking about making something like a Canada Food Guide, but specifically for Indigenous bodies, nutrition, something like without the 5 white gifts specifically, or know of one that exists.
So the question was, do I know of a Indigenous Canada's food guide, or
something like it that's more specific?
Well, I believe I'm not sure how old it is, but I know that there are very like Indigenous variations of the Canada's food guide available. However, I'm always a little bit hesitant about those guides, about the guides I've seen that are Indigenous focused, just because the foods that exist for an Indigenous community are so specific to place. To have a large national, let's say Canadian Indigenous food guide doesn't quite make sense in my mind, because of all of the diversity between nations and places, and what foods are available and what foods were, quote unquote, traditionally used or eaten. So I'm not, I know of some available, but I don't currently use them in any practice I do.